All right, so I'm going to go back ahead and try to finish up this recording that I was doing earlier, watching this talk by Jonathan Birch talking about higher order theory. So I already reacted to a bit of it. It was mostly a lot of setup and me talking. So let's see if we can go ahead and get to the video.
The talk is that two recent developments, when viewed together,
Ads.
May message siya tigangaram belsare.
are conscious. But I think recent developments have made that even more questionable than it was before, and in fact have put pressure on the very idea of there being a useful distinction here in the first place. So that's now the main argument of the talk, is that two recent developments, when viewed together rather than in isolation, put pressure on the idea of a clean first versus higher order distinction. Let's talk about the first development first. This is an argument from Nick Shea and Chris Frith for the claim that the global workspace needs metacognition. This was Trends in Cognitive Sciences 2019. So let's step back a little bit and explain what that claim means. The global workspace needs metacognition. Well, global workspace theory is one of the main best known theories of consciousness in the current field, and posits, I see its core commitments as this, that conscious processing is a mechanism that integrates content from many different local processes, including different sensory processes and motor and evaluative and memory, mnemonic, and then broadcasts the integrated content back to the input systems and onwards to a wide range of consumer systems, including systems of planning, reasoning, and decision making. So it posits a very close relationship between conscious processing and cognitive access, or what Ned Block called access consciousness. The essence of the theory is nicely captured in this diagram from Dehaene et al. Just gives you a sense of, the global workspace is where everything comes together from many different local processes. It's where the whole brain gets on the same page. And then that content, that all on the same page content, is then broadcast back and onwards. Something very attractive about this idea. But now let's ask, where do we place this in relation to the first order versus higher order distinction? Well, it's often described as being a canonical first order theory. For example,
Yeah, that's right. So in the first part of this video, I made this distinction already. There's no inner awareness involved in the classic version of it, unless you look at Bernie Barr's original version of Global Workspace in his 1988 book, The Workspace of the Mind, where he explicitly says that global broadcast is just a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition, and he thinks inner awareness isn't importantly involved. So I think that maybe what's going on here is that Birch is confusing the notion that all of these theories can come in a higher order or a first order version with the idea that there's no distinction here. There is a distinction. Theories do apply. Well, let me just let him finish, then I'll come back to Mike.
Carruthers thinks this. Carruthers, as I said, he used to defend a higher order theory. He now says he defends a first order view, and he says what's convinced him is the evidence for global workspace theory. So he clearly sees global workspace theory as being first order. Why might we think this? Well, there's no inner awareness as such. If you think about that diagram, everything comes together, gets integrated, gets broadcast, but there's no step in which a sort of inner eye looks in and watches the show. There's no role for an inner awareness mechanism in that picture. And Brown, Lau, and Ledoux agree with this. They say the inner awareness requirement of Hott distinguishes it from cognitive theories such as global workspace theory, which also invoke additional cognitive processes, but which don't posit inner awareness.
Yeah, this Brown guy sounds like he knows what he's talking about.
For this reason, global workspace theory is a variant of first order theory.
Yeah.
I think that's a widely held view. Shea and Frith, I see, as making an argument that puts a bit of pressure on this idea. Their basic argument is that for this mechanism to really work in the way described, there must be a metacognitive element to what is going on. So they say, well, how's this mechanism supposed to work? The global workspace has the function of facilitating access-related stuff, planning, reasoning, decision-making. To do this, it needs to be broadcasting useful information that is useful for planning, reasoning, and decision-making, information that will lead our decisions in the right direction, not lead us astray. But then to be useful for these functions, contents need to come with associated confidence ratings that say not just what the content is, but also how likely this is to be accurate. I think their case is largely empirical, but I think there's also quite a lot of intuitive and phenomenological plausibility to that claim. I think about, for example, you see a bird in the corner of your eye. Contrast that to a case where you see a bird in the center of foveal vision. Now, there's a difference in subjective character between the visual experience in the two cases, seeing a bird very, very clearly versus just catching it in the corner of your eye. But there's also a difference in the feeling of confidence. In the foveal case, I see the bird and I have this feeling of very high confidence that it's a bird, versus catch it in the corner of your eye. The experience has a different visual character, but also the feeling of confidence isn't there for me. I'm actually get this feeling of uncertainty. Was that a bird? Was it a plane? Was it Superman? I'm feeling very uncertain. Of course, if you're a highly skilled bird watcher, the visual character of the experiences may not significantly change, but those feelings of confidence really do. And you can build up a perceptual skill, so that you catch a bird in the corner of your eye and you're actually very confident about your identification of that bird. It's a skill I don't have. But in any case, it very much does seem as though representations, when they come to consciousness, they come accompanied by feelings of confidence. And Shea and Frith argue that really has to be the case if these representations are going to inform good decision making. If it were not the case, I'd be making much worse decisions than if I have those feelings of confidence. And so they argue that part of the integrative function of a global workspace mechanism involves not just broadcasting, but also the tagging and labeling of perceptual representations with consistent confidence ratings. Consistent in the sense that, well, it's no good if I'm confident that there's a bird in peripheral vision and confident that there's not. Now, the ratings have to be consistent. And so part of the role of the global workspace is to make...
Right. So I think this is an interesting, important argument, but it's not clear how this is going to get you to some kind of inner awareness, because these confidence labelings may be about what's out in the world rather than about the states themselves. So they might not be higher order. And if they are truly higher order, they might not be making one aware of being in the state, which is what is posited to be the crucial role, psychological role of inner awareness.
Sure that they are. They say we can think of an item in the workspace as representing something about the world, and at the same time representing the accuracy of that representation. The content it makes globally available includes both aspects. So this is a little bit of movement in the direction of higher order from a canonical first order starting point. So you might read this paper and ask, wait, so is global workspace theory, if we accept this amendment, is it now a higher order theory? Has it switched sides? Well, no, it hasn't, says Shea and Frith. This is not switching sides. Because, importantly, they say, this metacognitive tagging with confidence ratings need not involve any re-representation.
So this is the confusion on the part of Shea and Frith. Higher order theories don't all need to involve re-representing. There is a strong tradition of that of that way of thinking, where the higher order, the inner awareness is cashed out in terms of a higher order representation, which involves re-representing, although even that's not the right word, I guess I would say, but it just involves representing what's going on at the first order state. So this, however, is just what they're saying is that they're not re-representing it, but the confidence tag is just saying, accuracy, but not representing the content of the first order state. So now I see how he's going to connect this to the perceptual reality monitoring theory of Hak-Wan Lau, which I mentioned in the previous, this morning when I was watching the first part of this. So I think that's pretty clear how he's going to try to come at that. But what needs to be argued is more that this is a kind of awareness of those states, because that hasn't been argued. And I think that's what's crucially missing from the Shea and Frith metacognition idea.
So there need not be any re-representing, forming a new representation of the original content, such as there's a bird in the sky. And they say this is crucially different from metacognitive accounts of consciousness put forward by higher order theories, because there's no re-representation, there's no redrawing of that original content.
By the way, I don't like the word re-representation, because the idea is supposed to be that you have a first order state, which is representing something in the environment, say the color of an object. Is that re-representing the color of the object? I don't think so. There's some physical property and then a representation of that property. So now we have some mental property and a representation of that mental property. It's not a re-representation of it, although people who don't like this view often try to cast it in those terms because it makes it sound like it's weird, which is what they're trying to do. But it's not. It's just representation. Okay, let's go ahead and continue this, though.
From scratch. The representations in the workspace, they say, carry a built-in or linked confidence rating, akin perhaps to the metadata that we come across when we're looking at spreadsheets and PDFs and things in libraries. Familiar idea that data must come with metadata to be useful. And their argument is that representations in the global workspace have this built-in or linked metadata, but are not the objects of a distinct representation. So there's still no inner eye or inner awareness looking in. There's just built-in metadata.
So once again, though, he's assuming a particular kind of what inner awareness would have to look like. So it's correct that kind of inner awareness this doesn't implement, and it does seem like this doesn't involve any kind of inner awareness. It's just a tag saying that this is accurate or not. Certainly that qualifies as metacognitive, but if it doesn't qualify as making the subject aware of the state or being in the state, which is what inner awareness is thought to be doing. So I would put this argument in those terms. Yeah.
That's development one, putting a bit of pressure on first order, higher order distinction by introducing a metacognitive element to what's traditionally been seen as a first order theory, global workspace theory. Development two
By the way,
is Hakuan-Lau's theory, is perceptual.
There always was a metacognitive element to global workspace theory, as I said already. If you look at the original version from Bernie Bars, where he talked about the self system needing to access the broadcast, and that was really what was crucial. So you could have a version of global workspace theory that's higher order, or you could have a version of global workspace that's first order. The theory itself is neither. It's the theorists who adopt one particular position and develop the theory in that way. But the global workspace theory is not really by itself inherently one or the other. It depends on this issue about inner awareness. So I think that this has really been something that has been confusing to a lot of people, trying to come to grips with the idea that higher order theories really are a central dividing line. Every theory is either one or the other and can come in either version. And it really, the question is whether you would want to develop it or if it's interesting enough. Or as I see things, that's why I put it. Okay, so now we're going to get to the Hakuan-Lau
global workspace theory. Development two is Hakuan-Lau's theory, his perceptual reality monitoring theory that receives its clearest statement so far in his recent book, In Consciousness We Trust. A book, by the way, that I think is really good and a really good entry point to the current controversies around study.
Yeah, just as an aside, I like this book as well. I mean, I was reading drafts of it as Hakuan was writing it, and he was teaching a class at I think it was UCLA at the time, and he was making the slides and stuff available online as he was getting this draft ready. And obviously, we've written papers together and worked together for a long time. So, but it was interesting to see this book. I think is really a clear statement of his, not only his position, but his journey, how he came to the position and why he thinks that a particular approach is important. I, however, ultimately disagree with a lot of what goes on in this book. I do agree with a lot of it as well, but we don't really see things in the same way as much as we used to for various reasons. So that'll be interesting to talk about.
Consciousness scientifically. So bearing in mind everything I've said about Shea and Frith and remembering the link bit.ly/birchhot if you want to go back to any of that, let's think about this second development. Lau is offering a new member of the higher order family, as he sees it, one in which conscious sensory content is not re-represented, but only tagged as reliable. So it's taking away from traditional higher order theories the element of re-representing the original sensory content and replacing it with the kind of tagging. The basic idea is that perceptual representations are being monitored not by an inner eye exactly, that's forming its own representations, but rather by a discriminator mechanism, similar to those already developed in machine learning, where this discriminator has the task of essentially sorting the perceptual representations to try and work out which one's a signal and which one's a noise. In fact, it's a little bit more complicated than that because it's not just signal versus noise in Lau's theory, it's externally triggered signal, like bird is in the sky, versus internally generated content. So I imagine there was a bird in the sky. I hallucinated there was a bird in the sky, or just pure noise. There was nothing there. Certainly when I go out at night, I get all kinds of noise in my visual field. Some of it.
Yeah, so this is the interesting part of Hakuan's view, is that he wants the contents mostly to come from the first order states themselves, and for the higher order aspect just to be this kind of determiner, a pointer that says that's accurate, that's reliable, that's noise, internally generated, as Jonathan is saying here. So I think this is how he's going to try to connect it to the Shea and Frith stuff by saying that once you have gone that far, then the kind of confidence tags attached to the kind of metadata in the workspace that they're talking about is going to closely resemble the PRM model. I'm pretty sure that's where he's going to be going with this. So let's see.
It bears a passing resemblance to birds, but I don't have any feeling of confidence that it is a bird. In fact, I'm very confident that it's not. So the discriminator mechanism is trying to sort changes in the world from internally generated content from noise. Now, interestingly, this mechanism for Lau is implicit, subpersonal, automatic. To me, this marks another potential point of difference with more traditional theories in the higher order family, where explicit thought seems to be important, but Lau is quite insistent that you have your explicit reflecting on your experiences and thinking about them, and that can dissociate from this perceptual reality monitoring, which is implicit, subpersonal, and automatic. And in fact, that leads to one of the most appealing features of the view, which is the account of lucid dreaming. Lucid dreaming is then interpreted as a case in which the implicit, subpersonal, automatic reality monitoring is telling you this is all real, this is all reliable, but your explicit reflection on what you're experiencing is telling you it's not. And the rarity of that dissociation explains the rarity of lucid dreaming, according to Lau, which I think...
Yeah, so the explicit thing is important, but I would argue that all of the higher order theories have relied on implicit. Implicit is just a code word that means unconscious or not consciously done in often in psychological circles. So when Lau says it's implicit, it means you're not consciously thinking these things or having this reality monitoring. You're not consciously monitoring and all your internal stuff. It's something that's done under the hood, so to speak. But nonetheless, the subpersonal stuff really does mark a distinction between at least the version from Rosenthal and other persons like Rocco Gennaro and other people who want to insist on the folk psychological credibility of the kinds of representations. But the automatic and implicit thing, I'd say, is pretty standard for higher order theories. Yeah, so I don't really think that marks a contrast with standard ones, but maybe I'm misguided about that. Interesting. Okay.
It's a fantastic idea. So this is moving a lot from the traditional higher order view, inner awareness, higher order thought, in the direction of something much more implicit, subpersonal, automatic, monitoring and tagging of perceptual representation.
By the way, so on my way of thinking about things, in case anyone cares, is that what Hawkwan is trying to do, what Lau is trying to do here, is to develop what I call a relational higher order theory, which wants the phenomenology of the subject to be, in some sense, or at least in part, accounted for, explained by the content of the first order state. So that's clearly what Hawkwan wants. He wants it to be the case that when you're seeing red, there's a first order representation of red. There's a pointer saying that's accurate. I'm indeed, in that state, seeing red is what's going on. And then you experience the redness out there in the world, etc. That's how he wants things to be. And as it says here on the slide, there is no representing of that first order state in terms of describing it or somehow conceptually deploying concepts. I can't talk deploying concepts or anything like that, but rather you just list the address of where the state can be found and say that it's accurate. So I guess that this is different than the Shea and Frith model because it's not really attached to the first order state. It's something that the higher order system is using, as I understand Lau's view. Yeah, okay, but I see where he's going to go here is that, yeah, you've given a lot to the first order theorists by this point. There are other versions of what I call relational theories. They are quite popular, but I'm skeptical of them all for a different reason than this, but I don't know how much people care about that. But the basic reason I'd be skeptical of them is that it commits you to thinking about the first order states as though they exist in the way you experience them in the mind, even when you're not experiencing them that way. So that's a big problem for me from that side of the fence. But anyway, I don't want to derail this conversation because I want to hear what he's going to say about this.
There's no re-representation here. There's no taking of the perceptual representation and redrawing, forming a new representation. Rather, the perceptual states are simply referred to by an indexing or addressing system. So this discriminator is saying, well, the perceptual content that is at this address in the visual cortex, that's real. The content that is at this address, that's just noise. It's referring to them by addresses, not by re-representing. That's another crucial part of the view. As Lau puts it, the higher order state does not duplicate the first order content, but merely serves as a gating mechanism to direct the first order information to the relevant downstream processes. Also, another very interesting aspect of the view that I think Lau plays down in the book, but that struck me when I was reading it as very creative, is that there may be a form of time tagging as well. So it's the content's not just being tagged as this is real or this is noise, but also this is happening now versus this is happening in the past, or this may happen in the future.
Yeah, that's a good point that he's picking up on there. And it is interesting and an important part that isn't talked about, but you would have to explain stuff like this to explain things like the phi phenomena and things that get integrated over time intervals like that. So I think he's right to point that out.
So in that case where I just see a bird in the sky in the center of my foveal vision, and I'm really confident it's a bird, that also gets tagged as this is happening right now. The bird is there now. It's not in memory, it's not in the future, it's there right now. So I see this as a convergence from a very different direction, from very much a higher order starting point, towards a picture that is somewhat similar to that of Shea and Frith in certain ways. Remember, the Shea and Frith picture is about representations in the global workspace having built-in metadata, built-in confidence tags. This is now start with the basic higher order idea, the in-awareness idea, and posit that maybe it just involves these implicit subpersonal automatic tagging processes, where representations are referred to by an address, and the representation of that address is tagged as reliable. So you might ask, well, hang on, is this actually a version of the global workspace view now?
No.
Lau says it's not. He says, no, it isn't, because when the discriminator decides that a first order representation correctly represents the world right now, global broadcast and access are likely to happen, but these consequences are not constitutively part of the subjective experience, according to this view. So the view is one on which global broadcast is a likely consequence of the tagging process he's describing. Likely but not inevitable doesn't always happen. We sometimes get subjectively experienced content that is not globally broadcast.
Right.
So there is still a difference with the global workspace view. But still, these two recent developments, this global workspace needs metacognition argument.
Yeah, so before he goes on, yes, something interesting is happening. People are starting to realize that higher order theory is not a monolith and that there are different versions of it and that every theory out there has to take a side, and that we want reasons for thinking whether first order views all by themselves ever really could make sense. So I agree with them that something interesting is happening. The opposite, I dropped the opposite conclusion. Rather than saying, well, we want to move beyond higher theories, I say, no, we're finally starting to understand them. People are starting to finally try to piece this puzzle together.
And the perceptual reality monitoring theory strike me as convergence from two different directions on a common theme, namely the importance of what we might call metacognitive curation of perceptual states. Now, curation, just like we talk about data curation, the tagging of data with good metadata. Librarians absolutely love it. It's a big part of their job, curation. This metacognitive curation of perceptual states, especially forms of confidence and accuracy tagging. This is probably happening. This is probably noise. This is probably externally generated. This is probably internally generated. Also, I think really interestingly, this is right now. This is in the recent past. This is the distant past. This is a possible future. You can think of all of these adding of tags to our perceptual states as stuff that happens very fast, implicitly, subpersonally, automatically. Think of it all under the heading of metacognitive curation. We're seeing convergence from different directions on the importance of metacognitive curation to conscious experience. Now that leads, of course, to a terminological issue about where to place metacognitive curation in relation to that old distinction between first and higher order. And actually, there's no uncontroversial thing to say here, because if we're going to say that metacognitive curation is genuinely higher order, it genuinely counts as a very simple form of inner awareness, then the Shea and Frith version of global workspace theory is higher order, despite what they say. And by the same token, if we insist that metacognitive curation is not enough, it's not really inner awareness, it's something less than that, it's still first order, then Lau's perceptual reality monitoring theory has to be counted as first order. So, contrary to what he says. So on the terminological issue, someone is going to be annoyed either way, because there's no uncontroversial.
No, there's an ambiguity here, because the kind of curation that is going on in the Shea-Frith model is not the same kind of curation as going on in the Lau PRM model. One is explicitly aimed at trying to distinguish reality from imagination from noise, whereas the other is giving us confidence ratings about the stuff in the world, how accurate the representation is. It's not an awareness of the representation in any sense. So what Lau is trying to do is capture some sense in which we are aware of the first order states. So that seems to be more than terminological. And Birch doesn't seem to be picking up on the difference here. He just says, well, they both involve metacognition, so they're doing the same thing. But I don't think that they are, unless I'm missing something.
Way to sort these metacognitive curation processes in relation to the first versus higher order distinction. But I think, crucially, that terminological issue just doesn't matter. It's purely terminological in the pejorative sense. It doesn't really matter to our theorizing about consciousness. It's better to say that both of these pictures combine elements of earlier first order and higher order views in a way that actually
I mean, it doesn't, though. It does. But so the it's important to see that the Schoenfrith point applies even to unconscious processing. So it's not merely a terminological matter, and it does matter. It's a matter that matters. It's a mattering matter. It matters because the global workspace theory, which says you could have these confidence judgments about things in the world attached to the representations. Those could happen unconsciously. You could have those confidence ratings, like, maybe even a super blindside kind of case. You could have those stuff being broadcast, confidence judgments about those things in the world. The subject wouldn't be aware that those states were occurring simply because there's some confidence about the world going on. So the mere fact that there are confidence judgments about these things being accurate or not doesn't establish that they constitute a kind of inner awareness. And in fact, the Schoenfrith model really wasn't even about consciousness. Did my voice just go up? It wasn't about consciousness. It wasn't even about consciousness. They were talking about the global workspace theory, which has originally been postulated as a theory of consciousness, true, but it's just a theory about information being broadcast and shared and how behaviors are controlled ultimately. So I don't even really see the argument here. Both pictures combine elements of first order. I mean, I see that, yeah, Lau's view does, but the crucial question is, which element generates the subjective experience? That's not a terminological matter. And these two accounts are going to give different answers to that question. So if the global workspace theory is truly in the version of it that we're considering is truly a first order theory, then you say, well, look, what happens if you just somehow knock out the confidence ratings of these things, but they're still kicking around in the workspace? Is there still consciousness? Global workspace theory says yes. Just maybe not going to be very good for controlling or something like that, but it's still going to be globally broadcast and so forth and so on. Whereas higher order theory says no. And if you take it the other way and you say, well, look, you just have the confidence judgments somehow detached from the first order states, what do you get? Any consciousness or not? And even on the PRM, Lau is forced to say that you do get some consciousness. So if you somehow knock out the first order states and you just have the higher order pointing element, you're still going to experience something. He's not exactly clear about what you would experience, but I think it's relatively clear that you have to experience something on his view, because the pointing bit is what does the consciousness making. So if it points at nothing, you still get some consciousness. It's just going to be like, it might be like, I'm seeing something very distinctly, and then you go, what? And you're like, oh, nothing. It's nothing. That's weird. But you had a feeling of seeing something very strongly. That's what his view predicts. So the terminological issue, so it's not just a terminological issue. And I think, this is just wrong. It's not better to say that both pictures combine elements of first order and higher order views. They maybe do, but the way simply combining elements doesn't mean that there's no interesting distinction between the views. It just means the landscape's more complicated. But the question is, which widget is the load-bearing widget when it comes to experience? I think that's a question that makes sense. Well, yeah.
There's that traditional distinction and challenges the usefulness of it. It seemed really clear, really important, but now we're starting to see it's not so important. It's not so clear. The interesting views are in the middle because they're positing forms of metacognitive curation that don't fall unambiguously on either side. I think the real lesson of these two developments I've been talking about is that the first versus higher order distinction granting that maybe it was tracking a major fault line in our theorizing about consciousness in the 90s and 80s, is no longer really tracking a major fault line in theorizing about consciousness. Instead, theorists are converging from different directions around forms of metacognitive curation of perceptual states that, on the one hand, neither leave the content wholly unchanged as mere broadcasting would. So if you think about that, seeing the bird in foveal versus peripheral vision, the content is not wholly unchanged when that confidence tag is added. It's subjectively different to feel really confident that there's a bird there versus to be very uncertain. The content's not wholly unchanged. It's not mere broadcasting, but nor is there re-representing of the content from scratch, where that the representation that gets experienced and gets tagged is the representation that is formed by the visual system in visual cortex. There's no representing of the content from scratch, as in the traditional higher order thought picture. I think this is a welcome trend. I think it's a good thing. Of course, it's one thing.
Yeah, notice how he said higher order thought picture. So he seems to be conflating higher order theories with higher order thought theory, advocated by one specific very famous person. But there's a lot more to higher order theories than the higher order thought theory of David Rosenthal or anyone else. So that seems to be a large part of the problem here. The second is there may be convergence around the mechanics of this stuff in some sense, but the question is, what role are these things playing? That's the important question. And with respect to consciousness anyway, what we're trying to explain is subjective experience, the felt aspect of our life, phenomenology, etc., blah, blah, blah. And what part of it's doing that? And the way you figure that out is by knocking out different bits and seeing which part does what. If you tweak this bit, does it change anything? If you knock that out, does something correspondingly disappear? And, by having that kind of interventionist causational thinking, you try to figure out what's the widget that's important. So maybe there's no way to separate these things out in the way that would answer this question. But it hasn't been shown by this stuff.
To say there is a trend, and another thing to evaluate it positively or negatively. And some people might be, tearing their hair out saying this is a step backward. But I think it's welcome and a promising way forward, because I think that metacognitive curation views of consciousness have key advantages over the hardline views on both sides. If you think of hardline first order theories that say the representation is completely unchanged, no curation, versus the hardline higher order view that says it's re-represented in prefrontal cortex, so the original representation formed by the visual system in visual cortex is no longer determining the content of the experience.
Yeah, the question is what is experienced, and the way he was describing the Shane Frith already, if it's in the global workspace, you're experiencing it, then adding the confidence changes the experience. But so it's pretty clear then that it's the global broadcasting of that confidence that's doing it on that picture. Yeah, I don't see a blurring of the lines here. Sorry.
Constitutively, those views will always be wrestling with certain kinds of challenges that will make them quite unattractive. I think the hardline first order view will always have to be wrestling with the problem of the relative uselessness of uncurated representation. Data with no metadata, the content that comes with no information about how likely it is to be signal versus noise, really there versus not really there, versus the apparent usefulness of consciousness. Now, some people may dispute that, but I'm really pretty convinced that something as extraordinarily complicated and energetically expensive and hard to maintain as conscious experience must be performing extremely useful functions for organisms. And I think it's very plausible that there are extremely important functions relating to decision making that conscious experience is helping us with. And that'll always...
lots of people say this. I've never been convinced by this. I don't think this is such a red herring. I don't think it has anything to do with the issues, whether consciousness has a function or doesn't. So, I think it does too. And on the kind of higher order views that I like, the function of consciousness has to do with this getting into the workspace stuff. And other versions, it has no effect. I just don't really see why it's important. I want to explain what consciousness is. That's what I care about. So I don't really care about what it does.
You put the hardline first order view in a bit of a bind, because you're insisting that representation that is in a relatively useless format, uncurated, is nonetheless serving this incredibly important central function in our mental lives.
Oh, I see.
Meanwhile,
okay.
I think these middle ground views have advantages over the traditionalist hardline higher order views as well. So those views always have to wrestle with the wastefulness of re-representing content from scratch. I mean, the visual system and other perceptual systems generating all this content about the world and about our bodies, and then at some level, the hard line higher order view is that content is just a write-off. At some point, you've just got to start again and say, let's form a new representation of the world or the body, to which this first order stuff is causally relevant, it's a source of information, but it's not constitutively involved. There's always going to be rubbing up against the basic challenge that it seems like a wasteful architecture compared to what.
Yeah, but so what? You know what? Whatever it seems like to you is irrelevant. It could be the case. So I'm much more interested. I'm way less interested in what it seems like to people like Jonathan Birch or anyone. What it seems like to them is so uninteresting to me. I've read a couple of books recently that really pounded this home to me. So one was about the discovery of the synapse, and the other one was about the discovery of the action potential. Just the amount of ridicule that people piled upon the researchers trying to argue that there was electrical signal being generated, blah, 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 being transmitted in a certain way. Just the level of certainty that people this was called, I think the book that was being called The War of Sparks and Soups. I don't want to go into the base, but anyway, it's just amazing that something that we now think of as like the established dogma of neuroscience was not really even accepted, generally speaking, until 50 years ago or so. And it just boggles the mind that people can be so. It's just wasteful. Like, well, okay, maybe not. If you describe it as re-representing something that's already there, then I guess maybe. If you describe it just representing it, then it's not wasteful. I mean, is it wasteful that, that's how ecological psychologists talk about representationalists. Oh, why representing the world is already out there? Isn't that wasteful to represent the world when the world is just out there already with all that detail? Oh, all the detail is in the world. What's the brain doing creating a representation of it? So I'm getting all worked up now, and I don't mean to be, but my point is simply, this is an empirical question. Whether there is a system that represents the content of another system in the brain is an empirical question. Whether it seems wasteful to you, I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't have put an appendix in there that we don't use. That seems wasteful to me. Who am I to say? That's just the way it is. So that's the view I have about this. I just really don't like this kind of pontificating here about wrestling with the wastefulness. Nature has to wrestle with that. It's a question for nature. There either is or isn't this kind of system. We can ask questions that can give us some hints about whether there is or isn't this kind of system in the brain or not. And those are the interesting questions to me.
That simply curates the first order representations to get the maximum informational value out of them. Middle paths of the sort Lau and Shea and Frith are converging towards avoid both of those problems, and I think that makes them fundamentally more attractive than the hardline views on either side. So I think there's not just a trend here, but the trend is a welcome one.
Cool.
Now, of course, Shea and Frith and Lau don't agree about everything, but it's just that the fault line that separates them I see as not one that is naturally posed in terms of first versus higher order. It's rather that they're disagreeing about a different question. They both agree about the importance of metacognitive curation to conscious experience, and that's a big point of agreement. They disagree about something else, namely the question, is metacognitive curation sufficient by itself? If you've got this perceptual reality monitoring that is sorting the representations, real external, real internal, just noise.
Wait, is this guy for real? So this question is the question of higher order versus first order. Is a kind of inner awareness sufficient for conscious experience even without the broadcasting? Or do you have to have the broadcasting and you can lack the metacognitive curation? Oh man, okay. It's rough out here.
Is that sufficient for the representation to be consciously experienced? Or are you still missing something? That's a real point of disagreement, where Lau says, yes, it is sufficient. No, you don't need the content to be broadcast. So even if it's not broadcast, it's still consciously experienced. Whereas a true global workspace theorist cannot agree with that. They have to say broadcasting is also required. So there's a genuine point of disagreement there. Informally, what is the status of your edited but unused footage? It's gone into the camera. It's then been appropriately tagged and curated as reliable or not, but it was never broadcast. It was never aired, never got to the global workspace. what's the status of that? Is it subjectively experienced, or is it not? Is it pre-conscious but not conscious? Is it part of the material on which consciousness draws, or is it conscious in its own right? Now, that's an incredibly difficult question to answer. It's a question that connects to debates about overflow that have been running for years with no agreed experimental methodology to settle them. So there's a real point of disagreement there among people who agree about the importance of metacognitive curation, and it's a really hard one to ever settle. But for my purposes here, I'm not claiming to settle that question. I think the main point to take away is that that question that separates these views is not one about first versus higher order.
It is. What are you talking about here? What are you? Why is he saying that? So he must just have a very strange understanding of what it means to be higher order. It just must be, according to him, higher order theories are just ones that re-represent. If you re-represent the original content, then that's a higher order theory. Whereas what I think is obviously the case is that that's a version of higher order theory. There are versions of the theory which emphasize re-representation, or in his language, but just representation, as I would say. But the real question is whether or not inner awareness is sufficient for consciousness, or whether global broadcast is sufficient for consciousness. That simply is a version of the higher order versus first order dispute. So I'm not sure why. Well, I am sure, but I don't understand why he doesn't see that this is incorrect.
It's a different question, a fundamentally different question about whether metacognitive curation is sufficient by itself, or whether broadcasting is also required. So the disagreements are taking on different character. The fault lines are appearing in different places. All right, so in closing, I want to go back to animals, because I said this debate about first versus higher order theories is not just interesting in its own right. It also has this wider significance for animals, because it's sometimes been suggested, and if you were reading the 90s literature, you definitely get that impression, that first versus higher order is the big...
How much is left? There's 10 minutes. I think I'm going to stop now, because I don't know how much more of this I can take given what's already transpired. So the stuff is difficult, and I must be missing something, because it just seems to me that such an obvious mistake is being made here. I think he really is got a particular understanding that lodged in his brain about what this stuff means, and therefore he's dividing things up this way. But I disagree with that. So would like to, maybe I'm gonna, I should ask Jonathan to come on Consciousness Live. I just thought of that. Why didn't I think of that sooner? So hopefully he won't watch this first and say no. Or yeah, whatever. But we'll see. That's a good idea. I'll check with him and see what he says.